Okay, so I believe we can start. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you're all safe despite the unprecedented circumstances that we're currently facing. Thank you for tuning in for today's webinar, which is part of the Sports Medicine Engineering Series, initiative done in collaboration with the Clinician Engineer Hub. We're happy to have you. My name is Diane Ghanem. I'm a former soccer player for the Lebanese women's national team. I am now a dedicated student athlete and a third-year medical student at the American University of Beirut, Lebanon. I'm passionate about sports medicine and the biomechanics behind it. The Clinician Engineer Hub is an international hub that brings together the clinical and biomedical engineering fields and provides medical students and clinicians with an exposure to an endless possibility created by this intertwine. Today, I'm thrilled and honored to be the one hosting this event and introducing our three amazing speakers. So, Brianne is a certified prosthetist orthotist with extensive experience in treating a wide variety of complex patient populations with amputation. She holds a Bachelor in Exercise Biology from UC Davis and a Master's of Science in Prosthetics and Orthotics from Baylor College of Medicine. Her thesis investigated compensatory muscle activation patterns in transtibial sprinters. Brianne completed her residency at various facilities throughout the U.S., including the Naval Medical Center, Shriners Hospital for Children of Houston, and Scott Cavendish Prosthetics and Research. Constantly looking to create unique solutions for even the most difficult of presentations, she currently serves as a dedicated and caring prosthetist at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. Brianne has a deep-seated passion for the world of adaptive sports and continues to explore this in both her personal and professional endeavors. Robert Gigley. So he has been at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, Department of Physical Therapy for 30 years. He also has a joint appointment as a health science researcher in Miami Veteran Affairs Medical Center and is the director of the Functional Outcomes Research and Evaluation Center. His doctorate in prosthetics and orthotics was received from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, where he developed the amputee mobility predictor, an objective measure of amputee function, and most recently developed the comprehensive high activity mobility predictor. He has authored over 50 publications and has continued research efforts directed towards amputee rehabilitation, the biomechanics and metabolic cost of prosthetic gait, among many others. He was the recipient of multiple awards and is an honorary member of the AAOP. Ranjit Steiner, he's the Paralympic athlete that we have today. He was diagnosed with bone cancer in 2006 and elected to amputate his right leg above the knee in 2010 in order to regain an active lifestyle. He is a former 100-meter and 200-meter sprinter and long jumper who competed at the 2012 US Paralympics and won a bronze medal in the 200 meters dash at the 2014 US Paralympic National Championships. Since retiring from track and field, he still enjoys sprinting recreationally, single and three-track skiing, golfing, cycling, and hiking. Ranjit currently lives in San Francisco and works as a strategic account manager at DocMatter, a peer-to-peer education and collaboration platform for clinicians. Prior to DocMatter, he worked for Limb Innovation, a prosthetic socket manufacturer. In his free time, he also volunteers at Stanford Healthcare as a board member of their Adolescent Young Adult Patient Family Advisory Council and as a patient visitor for children who are undergoing cancer treatment. So before we start, kindly make sure your microphones are muted. All throughout the session, feel free to type in questions or concerns in the chat box. We will be taking questions at the end of each talk and then again at the end of the webinar if we have time. Thank you. Brianne, the floor is yours.
Okay. Is that?
That's perfect. We can see your
Okay, fantastic. All right, so thank you for the introduction and just the opportunity to speak with you all today. So as Diane said, I am a certified prosthetist orthotist working at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. I have studied the compensatory patterns of transtibial sprinters, and since graduation, I've worked with and been around Paralympic athletes both in my personal and professional lives. And while my participation in sport-specific prostheses has slowed, my passion for the field is not. I feel honored today to be able to provide you an introduction into the world of adaptive sport. So during today's presentation, we will review the prosthetic terminology before diving into the world of running-specific prostheses. We will discuss the evolution of running-specific prostheses, describing the patient population we work with, the basics of our evaluation, our goals when fitting a running-specific prostheses, and the components used to accomplish that. Prostheses are named based on what is missing. So medically appropriate terminology utilizes the Latin prefix trans, which means through. And we add the transected bone to that. They're also commonly referred to by the relation of the joint. So for example, a patient that undergoes an amputation through the tibia has a transtibial amputation, or is referred to as a below the knee amputation. A transfemoral or above the knee amputation is through the femur. Our initial evaluation gives us time to understand the patient in their entirety, to appreciate their hobbies, their passions, their livelihood. We palpate their residual limb and gather information regarding their limb shape, length, the bony prominences, evaluating the integrity of their skin, and taking into consideration any skin grafts or scarring. So we use this visit to determine the most appropriate prosthetic suspension and componentry that will be best suited for the patient. And this will help them to return to just a life of normalcy and the greatest independence. Prosthetic limbs are designed to emulate the amputated biologic limb through the use of responsive materials and shapes that mimic both the bones and the muscles that have been affected and lost due to amputation. Based on the shape and information gathered during the initial evaluation, the clinician will determine the most appropriate form of suspension. The interface and suspension of the prosthesis is the most critical aspect of the design, as this provides the direct control and comfort of the device. This is the first and most important stage in prosthetic success. Gel liners are the most commonly used interface for prosthetic devices, as they act as a protective barrier for the skin, reducing the shear forces and the impact on the residual limb. Liners will utilize a pin lock or a suction-styled suspension. Pin locking liners tend to be more frequently used for amputees that are plagued by greater volume fluctuations, and this could be caused by a recent amputation or comorbidities. Suction-styled suspension is held as kind of the superior styled suspension, as it just provides the greatest control of the device through a more intimately fit socket and increases the weight-bearing capacity. And with greater control comes improved proprioception, which is why this style of suspension is held kind of in superior design. This increased proprioception gives the perception that the prosthesis is an extension of the athlete or of the patient. So I'm sure you can imagine how this sensation and perception, it could be beneficial when coming into regards with running specific prostheses. As previously stated, the prostheses are designed to mimic the missing bones and articulation. Prosthetic feet vary based on the material in their design. Sag feet stand for solid ankle cushion heel. This is kind of our most basic category of prosthetic feet. Flexible keel offers some dynamics to the forefoot. Multi-axial feet often conform to more uneven surfaces. Dynamic response feet are more responsive in nature, and this category of feet is fit on those that are have the potential or ability to ambulate at a varied cadence. These feet store and release energy due to or during the gait cycle and spring back to provide a push-off as the carbon fiber deflects back into space. This provides the patients with a more symmetric gait pattern. Running-specific prostheses are categorized under the dynamic response feet, so we'll primarily focus on that category today. Prosthetic knees are also based on the needs, activity, and goals for the patient. The number of axes, the mechanics of the control, and the inherent stability is determined based on the patient's presentation and physical needs. Fluid knees are most commonly fit on patients that have the potential to ambulate at a varied cadence, as the resistance of the knee will change based on the patient's speed. Friction knees are intended for patients that ambulate at a single speed or more so are household ambulators. Prosthetics are made out of carbon fiber, a lightweight yet super durable and strong material. Well, back in the 1970s, Van Phillips was involved in a traumatic water skiing accident resulting in a transtibial amputation of his left leg. So as the story of many great innovations go, he turned this tragedy into triumph and changed a nearly non-existent world of adaptive sport into one that challenges the ability of able-bodied athletes. Van was a student at Northwestern University Prosthetics and Orthotics Center. As a new amputee, was frustrated with the prosthetic options available. He recognized the dire need for adaptive equipment, and he acted on it. He tested these ideas in mimicking the gastrocnemius in the Achilles tendon, inspired by the hind leg of a cheetah, the spring of a diving board, etc., and designed the original flex foot. This initial design incorporated a heel and a J-shaped prosthetic blade. And this translated into a spring, storing energy with weight bearing and releasing energy during push-off. This original design transformed the world of adaptive sport, as nearly all running-specific feet have evolved from this initial idea. Running-specific prostheses are often fit on patients with congenital deficiency or a traumatic amputation. For those that did not run prior to their amputation, it's unlikely that they will successfully pursue running post-amputation. As we continue through this webinar, with Dr. presentation, you'll learn more just about the challenges that in regards to athletes returning to sport. So the athletes that are looking to return and are successful in it work closely with their prosthetist and physical therapist to ensure comfort, fit, and function of their prosthesis, as well as prevention of habitual gait deviations, working on muscular imbalances and compensatory patterns that present with the loss of a limb. So unfortunately, most insurance companies do not view running or activity-specific prostheses as a medical necessity. With this, patients will often resort to nonprofit foundations to pursue their athletic endeavors. So similarly to our evaluation regarding a day-to-day prosthesis or just an everyday lifestyle prosthesis, we must ensure that we're appropriately evaluating the patient for a running-specific device, taking into account their presentation, the multi-limb involvement, whatever goals they may have, both clinically and recreationally or professionally. These factors all aid into the determination of the proper suspension and componentry for the running-specific devices. So in prosthetics, we are fitting a static device on the dynamic nature of the human body, designing it to respond in a similar manner as the amputated limb. With increased activity, the proprioception of the limb in space becomes an integral part of trusting the prosthesis. This increased motion increases the shear forces with the socket, leading to greater opportunity for skin breakdown, which, as Dr. Gailey has kind of already discussed, there's a lot of issues with skin breakdown, especially when we're discussing high activity sport. So it's well known that running increases impact and forces on our body and joints. This impact during the stance phase for a prosthetic user only increases the pressures within the prosthetic socket and the load on the residual limb. Currently, the gold standard for running-specific prostheses utilizes silicone liner and a suction-styled suspension. Running-specific prosthetic feet are made of carbon fiber, and they're designed on a spring mass model utilizing both the shape and the to respond to the weight-bearing stance phase with a release of the stored elastic energy through forward propulsion as the toe pushes off, simulating normal human running gait. The C-shaped feet often have a proximal attachment to the prosthetic socket and rely on the softer nature of the blade and the more forgiving shape to deliver over time. Due to this characteristic of the C-shaped foot, it's often fit on athletes that are looking to run more recreationally or for a longer distance. The J-shaped prosthetic feet typically have a posterior attachment to the prosthetic socket. They have a stiffer and more aggressive shape of the blade, providing a rapid release of the energy, hence being more appropriate for athletes that are sprinters and require that stiff springing energy return. The design of the prosthetic foot makes it inherently unstable in static standing, as it's aligned to aid in forward propulsion. This is especially important to consider when we're discussing athletes with bilateral amputation. The stiffness for both of these designs is determined on athletes' body weight. So athletes with above knee amputation have the option to utilize a prosthetic knee or to run with a stiff prosthesis. A stiff or straight leg prosthesis will induce gait deviations as the athlete is not able to shorten the leg during swing phase. That requires them to circumduct or abduct their residual limb in their prosthetic limb and enable them to clear the toe during swing. This can just cause an increase in wear on just the proximal joints and the ligaments over time, and results in a less efficient and more taxing gait, like running gait. The knee component encourages a more symmetrical running pattern and enables the athlete to engage in a more normal human locomotion gait pattern. The hydraulics of the knee allow for varied cadence and increased load. The only prosthetic knee that's on the market for sprinting is this 3S80. This allows for a low level of resistance to get the knee out quickly, ensuring the athlete is supported and prepared during the subsequent stride. Adjustments in the knee allow for the prosthetist to optimize their stance and swing phase adjustments as suited. And this knee also has a manual lock, which again kind of gets back to our bilateral users or the instability just during stance, and allows them to put the lock on while they're not in competition. So for any prosthesis, prosthetists start with a standard bench alignment and make adjustments based on their observational gait analysis and watching the dynamics of the patient or the athlete ambulate. When discussing running-specific prostheses, we optimize the attachment based on the desired weight line and landing position of the prosthetic foot. So if you may have guessed, the different shapes and functions of the running-specific prostheses also require a slightly different alignment. This is just based on the shape of the prosthesis, patient's current abilities, and their future goals. So to account for vertical compression of the blade, the prosthesis is intentionally 25 to 50 millimeters tall. The weight line should fall anywhere between 2.5 to 4 centimeters from the distal end of the toe, from the tip of the toe, and start with approximately 7 degrees of socket flexion. The alignment can affect step frequency, landing rate, contact time, total leg stiffness, and overall just impacting the performance of the athlete. Running-specific prostheses are modeled and aligned to emulate the spring-like pattern of biological limbs during running. Sprinters' alignment is slightly different as it requires a more up-on-the-toes gait pattern. Our goal is to best mimic the biomechanics of the sound limb and the athlete without amputation. So with intention to provide inclusion and fair competition, the IPC, the International Paralympic Committee, classifies the sport by providing structure for competition for varying levels of impairment impacting their performance. So this classification system applies to those with amputation above the knee and below the knee in differing classes. As you may notice from these pictures, athletes that have bilateral above the knee and unilateral above the knee compete in the same class. And it kind of depends on how many athletes are participating, but often bilateral and unilateral will compete in the same class. This athlete has a bilateral above knee amputation and uses bilateral prosthetic knees during the sport. And she doesn't have a sound side to help determine her height. The World Athletics Committee utilizes a maximum allowable standing height based on trunk length and intact limb length. The studies have been done to better understand the mechanics and the mechanisms of athletes with amputation. This has been a hot topic as Paralympic athletes continue to push the boundaries of the sport. So as the subject size continues to be a limiting factor, we've analyzed compensatory muscle activation patterns, differences between sprinting and jumping with a running specific prosthesis. We've gained a better understanding of the associated metabolic costs of running with a prosthesis and the effects of endurance and ground reaction forces. Studies have shown a reduction in ground reaction forces across all speed in the limb that utilizes a prosthesis. And also, to tag on to what Dr. Gailey said, there was an unexpected similarity of speed across varying prosthetic heights. We also found differing muscle activation patterns between limbs. So while this is a bilateral above the knee long jumper, recent studies have been performed evaluating unilateral transtibial sprinters and long jumpers and found that there's a limitation on top speed production during the sprint portion, but the alignment of the below the knee transtibial sprinter for jumping may improve their ability for takeoff. So I wanted to just leave you today thinking about the controversy regarding athletes using running-specific prostheses. Are these running-specific devices actually giving athletes with an amputation an advantage over athletes without an amputation? And if so, how do we define this so-called advantage, and is it measurable? How do we better study it? And how many subjects are sufficient to draw these conclusions? There's a lot more research that is yet to be done just to be able to conclusively answer any of these questions. Are there any questions?
So, Brian, there's a question from an orthopedic surgeon, and he says, are there any prerequisites in terms of muscle stock for the use of such prosthesis?
I am not sure what you mean in terms of muscle stock, but yes, I'll go back to just fitting the device. We can try and compensate for any instability or muscle loss just through the use of the alignment and making the prosthesis more inherently stable or unstable, and then also working closely with physical therapists just to ensure that any gait deviations are accounted for, and we're doing our best to either align for them with the prosthesis or working with the athlete to improve those imbalances. So there are differences between congenital amputation and traumatic. Yes, the most drastic difference is just the attachment of the muscle. So with congenital amputees or with congenital differences, they tend to have their muscles still attached. And so they may have like a greater load or just understanding and proprioception and control of their limb and space. And versus traumatic amputations where some of the attachment points for the muscles that are being utilized and maximized during a sprint have been transected, which will dramatically impair performance.
We have one more question from a medical student. says, is there any harmful compensation in an amputated athlete that can affect the spine alignment?
I'm sure yes. Over time, I think Ranjit may be better able to kind of speak on that just from his experience. But I would say there is a lot of load and a lot of wear that's required on the proximal joints in the patient's body. Running with a prosthesis is just very taxing on any of those joints. And because the body is moving in a way that it wasn't necessarily intended to, different compensatory patterns are bound to present with the newest attachments. And with the design of a prosthesis, we do our best to mimic the sound body and the biologic limb, but it's not exactly the same.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.
Of course.
Shall I start or?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Welcome everybody. What I'd like to talk about, if I could, is a little bit about this idea of the blades and what the athletes call prosthetic doping. A little bit different than drug doping. It's how to use the prostheses to gain an advantage, and can that actually happen? So basically what we have to do is gain control of my computer. There we go. If you go back to the first time that we really started looking at sports in this population, it was back in Seoul, Korea, during in 1988, and this was the type of prostheses that everybody was using. So as we were getting ready to go to Barcelona, now you probably figured out that I'm an old man, because if I was the guy who was a physical therapist that were working with folks between 1988 and 1992, you would be correct. And so you can see the differences that took place in prosthetic devices between that. And in 1992, I was at a meeting in Canada, and literally on a napkin with a biomechanical engineer by the name of Ian Fleming, at lunch, we were talking about how, and he had nothing to do with amputees, how could we get amputees to run faster? And he said, well, if you took and created a spring by doing this, this, and this. And this was the first look that we had. And it was actually to help this young man right here, Tony Volpentest, who earlier had shown up, and he was a congenital amputee who was running on a pair of rolled up Nikes. Fast forward to 1996, and he wins all the gold medals at the Atlanta Games. But probably the person who made it most famous about prosthetic doping and the idea of height and is Oscar Pistorius. Unfortunately, Oscar's become more famous today for the murder of Reva Steenkamp, but it first started out with this idea that we had an amputee who could now compete with able-bodied athletes. So Oscar, and what makes it unique, and as you watch a number of the folks that are some of the top athletes out there, they're congenital. So he was born without fibulas, and it was at 11 months that they decided to amputate his legs. But while he sustained a knee injury playing rugby as a 15-year-old, it was his physical therapist who suggested he start sprinting. So they made some cheetahs for him, but they were just rolled up carbon fiber. They were homemade. So he goes to the United States, and when he arrives in the United States, there were a couple of athletes that were there, Marlon Shirley and Brian Frazier and others. And what they said, hey, he's a 16-year-old kid, let's help him out. So we had new legs made for him. It showed him what had to do. They line up in Athens, Greece in 2004. The gun goes off, and Brian Fraser was right next to him, and he heard Oscar slip. And he kind of chuckled and said, well, it's his first race. He's only 16. That's fine. And then all of a sudden, as they're running the 200, here's clap, 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 clap. And as they're making the turn, that kid who slipped and fell was coming right behind him. And here's Oscar winning his first race against the guys that were supposed to be Danny Andrews, Marlon Shirley, and Brian Fraser, 1, 2, 3. And Oscar makes the stage. So Danny actually is an engineer, just like everyone here, and he was an athlete, actually has more medals than most Paralympic athletes, but he came to the University of Miami, and that's me at a younger man age, working with him, and he was a Division I athlete. And what we did is we figured out ways in which we could take the height and we could take the flex or the stiffness of the prostheses, and we could actually take and calibrate it to the athlete to get the optimal stride. And so we would heighten, we would shorten, we would use different limbs, and it worked well. Well, while we're doing that, Oscar's out, and he's becoming an inspiration for folks. And so the IAAF decided, hey, this guy's great. Look at what he can do. He's an inspirational athlete. Let's invite him to all these races. And, you know, he'll be a nice human interest story. And then all of a sudden he wins a couple of races against able-bodied athletes. So then the IAAF said, we're going to prohibit the use of technological aids like springs and wheels. Well, the wheels is easy. That's wheelchairs. Don't want that. But springs, they said, were his prosthetic devices. Oscar, you're out. Well, let's back up and let's look at what happens with an amputee athlete running the 400 meters one time around the track. Well, you got to come out of the blocks. And this is where able-bodied athletes push off the blocks, they stay low, and they build up the speed. Problem is that if you're in two prostheses, you don't have plantar flexors or gastroc soleus to push off, so you have to lift with your hips in order to get out of the blocks. And oh, by the way, you can't crouch down like a normal athlete. You got to stick your butt way up in the air, so you can't stay low. In fact, the power generated is significantly less. Now, many racers are won in the first 10 meters. And what they find is that with the amputee athletes, they have to pop straight up to an upright position where other athletes can stay low and cut down the resistance and build up their power slowly. And as a result, that's where they can build that speed and then break into the regular stride. If you're wearing two prostheses, you can't do that. You got to pop straight up. And it takes you a while to get the rhythm, so that creates a problem. Then in the 400, you go right into a turn. And the biggest issue is that there was this sense that the centrifugal force as you go into the turn's a problem, because we're seeing that left-sided amputees were always doing better than right side because they could drive with their right leg or their sound leg into the turn to prevent any kind of medial lateral displacement. Well, if you got two legs, you can't do that. And a lot of the competitions were on somewhat of a wet track. So that creates a problem. Then you have this ability to keep your legs together to cut down the amount of medial lateral motion. Well, a study that was done by Alarino finds is that this is normal non-amputee running, and one leg crosses in front of the other. Newton's first law, body in motion remains in motion unless opposing forces are acted upon it. Unilaterals have a little wider base of support. Bilaterals have a big wider support. So they even have more of a problem trying to drive that leg into the limb or into the lane. Then you get each stride. What made Oscar different? What makes Blake Leeper different? What makes the other athletes that accomplish this? A, they lost their limbs at a very early age. B, they never had ankles that they had to rely on. And three, they had this thing called neuroadaptation. They're able to use their hip extensors, quads, and other muscles in order to have the same frequency as the deflection of the prostheses. So they become one with the prostheses. That's why you don't see somebody who later in life who was in a car accident or had other issues actually becoming an athlete who is accomplished in sport because they don't have that mechanism. Finally, at the finish line, this is where everybody breaks down. The one who wins any race from 800 to 400 to 200, 100 meters is the person who slows down the least. When you see Usain Bolt just blowing past the competition saying, whoa, he's kicking in the afterburners, he's going faster. Well, it's not because he's going faster, it's just the other guys are slowing down more. And when you're a bilateral amputee, you can see these guys, they're just barely holding on to their legs as they come because they're exhausted and they got to control the limb. So this whole idea of heightening, it's not new. In fact, Tony Volkman has, back in 1992, the IZOD, who was the ruling body for the IPC for amputees at the time, come up with this crazy deal that said we're going to take the overall length of the leg, the prostheses, where then we're going to take and find that it's less than 0.4% plus 5%, and we'll do it all in centimeters. It was a crazy thing with no science. I will grant you is that the two things determine how fast somebody goes is stride frequency and stride length. And so we see that the ground is both the friend and the foe to the athlete. And when you never see a person that is 5'2" or a short person lining up in the 100 meters. If you look at Usain Bolt, he's 6'5". Oscar Pistorius theoretically should be 6 feet 2 by all measurements we took, and Michael Johnson is 6'1". So every athlete knows how many steps they need to win. Well, and how many steps they need in the 100 meters, the 200 meters, or the 400 meters. So now this whole heightening thing rears its ugly head again. So the IPC, International Paralympic Committee, now has a maximum allowable height that they're allowing. But they measure your elbow length and they have you sit up to measure your trunk. And I've been around a lot of athletes. I've been around Michael Johnson. I've been around Carl Lewis. And the one thing that strikes me about these guys, when I stand next to them, and I'm fairly tall, I'm a little over 6 feet, their hips come to my ear. These guys have longer limbs. So the MASH, as Brianne's going to talk about the MASH, so I'm going to hold off on that. But the idea that height makes a difference has been disputed. So Alina Grabowski, and this is her on the right, who's out of Colorado, and her team took 5 bilateral transtibial amputees. They put them on 3 different types of feet, like you see here. They put different combinations of stiffness and height, followed the same protocol that we did for years, and then basically put all the combinations together. What did she find out? The J shape works better than the C shape. There's no difference in height and stiffness. The longer the stride, the slower the turnover. So basically, yeah, you can have long legs, but you're not going to be able to motor as fast. There's an optimal height and an optimal turnover rate for athletes. Running speed inversely related to the stiffness, how fast somebody goes, and then the stiffness is a greater influence than height. And that's the same thing that we found. So basically, for every 2 centimeters that you increase a person's height, the results found there was no significance in overleg stiffness, and we'll talk about stiffness in a second, but it did correlate with the contact time. So as you got higher, your contact time was longer, and therefore you decreased your step frequency because you stayed on the ground longer. You need the ground to generate the power, but you stay too long, it slows you down. And then also the ground reaction forces decreased by about 0.25%, which means that was longer contact time. And so prosthetic height did not influence compression. In fact, one of the biggest issues that we find with the stiffness is in the human body is that as we run faster, the leg supinates more, and as it supinates or internally rotates, the leg becomes stiffer the faster we run. However, amputees get one category of foot. So the faster they run, the more there's a decrease in the stiffness because that's a constant. Therefore, they decrease by about 17%. Some other studies by McGowathall found is that it decreased almost by 19%. So the matter of fact is that if you look at other level amputees, you'll find the same thing, and Hobera out of Japan has done some of the most work, and so he found there's about a 12% decrease. So now you don't have the ankle and the foot, so where do they get the power from? Well, they get the power from the contralateral hip. So the hip has to generate 74% more power to compensate for the lack of calf or gastrocsoleus on the other side. So the hips are always working, and that's where the increased power comes from. Now, in order to get the maximum power in knee flexion, as we found by Elena's work, but it goes back to Buckley, that shape that we designed back in 1992, the J shape of the flex foot, makes all the difference in getting the person to get over the toe, buying more time to get the hip up, because the higher you can get this hip up, the more power that you can generate, especially in absence of the ankle. And that's basically how it works. So basically, the hip generates 2 to 3 times more work than the sound limb, compensating for the loss of plantar flexors. Therefore, the human body becomes a spring. So in non-amputees, the hip is just a stabilizer. It's a minor energy absorber and generator. The knee is a major energy absorber as you strike the ground. And then the ankle is a major energy generator. In amputees, it's reversed. The hip is the energy absorber and generator. The knee is a minor absorber, and there's really no energy generated at all out of the ankle. The problem is that if you look on the prosthetic side has very little, but as the speed increases, it has a decreased amount of load. Therefore, it can only return a decreased amount of energy. Whereas you look at the intact limb, it takes a greater amount of load, and then you have to it gives the ability to generate greater acceleration, but it can't be asymmetrical. And this imbalance is where unilaterals have a problem. Bilaterals can get that synchronous neural adaptation. And by the way, this black bar, that's controls. So you can see is that there's an imbalance to the intact limb. By the way, this whole idea that there's an energy increase is Mary Beth McCardle, who was one of my students years ago, demonstrated is that actually the only difference when you look at the metabolics is the heart rate, and the heart rate in the amputees is a little bit higher. So go back to Newton's first law. The key is to find what is the balance in the width of walking base, because it's going to be greater for the amputees. That's going to give them better lateral balance as they move from side to side. It will help them to maintain the balance because they have the same balance challenges in the turns as able-bodied or non-amputee sprinters. And that asymmetry as they make the turn suggests a lot of variability, and that compensation for that placement of the foot could slow them down. By the way, when they looked at Oscar and before he went to the Beijing Olympics, they came back and they said, you know what? The energy storing foot has an 89% energy return, but the human foot only has a 36% energy return. I was on the review committee. What they did is they took the muscle out, because we know that carbon fiber, it stores energy and releases energy, but it can only give back 100%. But you got to lose some energy to heat dissipation and to vibration. And that's exactly what happened with the carbon fiber foot. But the human foot stores energy and adds on with the muscle, and that becomes the difference. That when you take out the muscle, the inert tissues, the ligaments, give a 36% energy return. So this report by the IAAF, where they said that he had an advantage, would hold true if everybody would cut their gastrocnemius out and compete that way. Don't think it's going to happen. So basically, they said that he incorporated springs into his limb, and when they looked at the work that was done in Houston, there was nothing that was there. So the Committee on Arbitration in Sport said, you know what? The human body has springs. Now, Oscar wins. Then he goes out and loses immediately to a young man from Brazil, Alan Oliveira. And first thing he says, oh, he was heightening. Did you see how tall he was? and we all cringed because we spent 3 years defending Oscar. So in summary, look where the times are. Oscar did a 45-second. Blake Leeper, who's now getting ready for Tokyo, is at 44 seconds in the 400 meters. When you look at this compared to Michael Johnson, and ironically, Wade Vandernerk, who owns the world record, is also from South Africa. So you have 2 Americans, 2 South Africans. He now has the record at 43 seconds. So basically, if Blake covers and then Vanderwerk is less than a snap to when they win. We've seen the times change over time, but it's mostly not because of the technology. This was the very first limb we designed way back when. But it's because the athletes, the training, and the heart that they bring. So it's never the equipment, it's always the athlete that makes the difference. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Daly. This was beyond amazing, very informative, very clear. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Daly, this is the time to ask. So we'll be having questions after each talk, and then in the end, if we still have time. But Dr. Daly won't be with us by then, so if you have any questions, please feel free.
Hi, Dr. Bailey.
Hello.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I know athletes' shoes they have like spikes to ameliorate the grip so they don't slip. So I want to see if these prosthetics have such spikes, or do you study do you focus on the grip?
Yeah. So great question. So what they do is on the bottom of the foot, I don't have spikes in my office, but what they do is they glue to the bottom of the prosthesis a sole that would be similar to their opposite limb. So but one of the issues is you can only have so many spikes. And we've had a couple of guys try to get a few more spikes in there. It really doesn't make a difference how many spikes you have. But Nike makes the Nike sole that amateur athlete can just slip on and off, so they can use their everyday leg. But all the top athletes that would have a foot that they would use just as their sport limb, they're going to glue it on, and they'll have a different surface just like any other athlete. There's different spikes, different treads, depending on the distance and the quality of the athlete.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Okay, so I have a question here that was sent in private. So it's, are we able to grow with these them as we grow? So will we be able to use them for elderly or not?
I'm sorry, you broke up on me just a little bit with the question. I apologize. So
More.
what is it?
So,
Yeah.
So that, do we grow well with those prosthetics, or do they need to be adjusted over time? So do we need to fix them or not as we grow?
Yeah, so if I understand right, as people grow, do we have to change the height of the prosthesis or change the design?
Absolutely. The whole prosthetic, or is it adjustable?
So it all depends. If it's a child, the prosthetists are very good at determining, okay, how do I buy some extra time? So they'll start a little taller, and then they'll be at the right height, and then it might be a little shorter. That way, it's not as costly. For the athletes, one of the issues is we always look for symmetry. So if we're talking about the athlete, what will happen is we actually, if they're bilateral, they're the same height. If they're a unilateral, they'll be slightly taller, because as they come down onto the leg, they'll compress, and they can compress as much as a centimeter or two. Therefore, we change the height. But most prostheses only have a lifespan of 3 years. In children, they grow quickly, but after that, you come back in and adjust it, and the process will take care of it.
Absolutely, makes sense. So would you recommend the running prosthetics or regular prosthetics? What's your...
Oh, that's a great question. So I recommend to everybody, it's any sport. First, you start off with your everyday leg. We train because we run running clinics throughout the U.S. and actually Europe and elsewhere. And so we don't tell people to come with a running leg. We can teach anybody how to run on any limb. Now, the science shows us is that you have a better symmetry in running with the running design leg, but you start first with your everyday leg. If you like it and you want to continue with it, that's when you make the investment into a running leg. But you don't have to start with a running leg. You know, it's like somebody deciding they want to go into cycling. You start off cycling. Do you buy the most expensive bike, or do you see if you like it and then invest as the sport grows on you? So it's no different than any other sport, and it's no different than any other type of sporting equipment.
Great, thank you. So we have 2 more questions real quick. We have a doctor in physical therapy, Johnny, who says, is there any extra preventive measures done for these athletes to prevent muscles or tendons injuries?
Oh, great question. So we long time ago, when I was really involved in the Paralympics, we started to, we created a registry of injuries. And it turns out is that the injuries are exactly the same as any other athlete. It's going to be, muscle strains. There's going to be ankle problems. The only thing that creates a major problem is the skin. Inside the socket with the interface, and as Brianne was talking about, they have gel liners now. But when I traveled with our U.S. Paralympic team, I spent more time treating skin than anything as far as muscle injuries and what have you. But you treat them exactly like you would treat any other athlete.
Perfect, thank you. And the last one from an orthopedic resident, Aaron, he says, if an athlete presents with a severe injury to the foot, so including neurological and vascular injury like being shot in the foot, would you say that the athlete shows a better adaptation to the prosthetic after early amputation versus trying a more conservative management and then later amputating if the conservative management fails?
Yeah, that I can speak to pretty well. As you may have been aware, the United States has been in a couple of conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we've had about 1,600 soldiers come back, many of who I've worked with to teach how to run. We tried on several hundred of them to do limb salvage and maintain the limb. There is a brace out there called the IDEO, which was designed at the Center for the Intrepid in San Antonio. That's excellent. And the same design and principles as a cheetah to allow pain-free running for somebody who has a limb. However, that doesn't always work out. And then a year, sometimes 2 years later, they decide to have the amputation. Most people, it's not a problem to teach them how to run. They know how to use their hip and what have you. The biggest loss is the time down, the atrophy, the weight gain, and that type of thing that just comes with the inactivity.
Absolutely. Makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still have time for one more?
Sure. No problem.
Okay. So Noel says, where do you think we could cut costs in the design and manufacturing process when making running prosthetics in order to make it more accessible to people who don't have the means?
That is a terrific question. I was, after the earthquake in Haiti, we were down there for some time, and one of the things that we did is I became a European football owner, Team Zerion, which is tarantula, which is the little spider you take when their legs off, they get vicious, but it was the Haitian amputee soccer team. And so a lot of our guys did a lot of running. You don't play with prosthetic limbs. But what we did is we created inexpensive limbs. Hang on one second. Well, we created inexpensive limbs out of copolymer plastic. This is just a model. I couldn't reach the other one, where you can actually take the polymer and you can have a very dynamic limb. So it's not a running limb and it fits into a foot shell. So if you can take a polypropylene, and then what we did is we create a way to cut along the way, and this would be for a foot, then it actually had terrific dynamics. And the most expensive part of it was the foot shell. So you could, in developing nations where access to carbon fiber, which is a costly, expensive way to design it, just taking the copolymer plastic and then actually cutting along how that person moves turned out to be a fantastic way that we were able to teach running to people who otherwise would not be able to.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Gailey. It was a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
They say, is this correct? If you invest more money, you can get a better designed blade, and so your performance is better.
That's not true. You know, we have a expression in golf. It's not the arrow, it's the Indian, and it's true with running. The blade doesn't win the race. It's the athlete that wears the blade. The blade is just a small percentage of the contribution. It's like saying, hey, if we all wore Nikes and went out and played in a football game, we'd win the World Cup. Doesn't work that way.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Gailey. It's a pleasure to have you here. Of course, you can stay for as long as you want to, but I know you're busy. So thank you for answering all of our questions. All right, so Ranjit, I think the floor is yours.
All right, great. Thank you. Really appreciate you guys taking the time and inviting me here today. So I wanted to just share some brief background kind of on Paralympic track and field as a whole, and a little bit about my personal journey. So so I'll start kind of with my personal journey, walk you through some of the classifications for the Paralympic categories and Paralympic competition, as well as the events that the different classifications undergo. And then finally kind of walk you through a little bit about my training program and how that was developed over the years to kind of go from that initial stage to competing at the Paralympics in 2012 and 2014. So here's two photos. So on the left is the day after my amputation. I was in the hospital, starting my rehab, right? Pretty much immediately out of the amputation, you're getting rehab within the hospital. You're actually doing as much load bearing as you can on the amputated side. So it's a very quick process. When I first amputated my leg, when I lost my leg, this was, I thought it was going to be a much more sort of long process to get back on my feet and be able to walk again. But it was actually relatively quick in getting there. And then, of course, the development to be able to run and jump, that's obviously a much longer process. But to back up a little bit, I lost my leg to bone cancer. So I was 15 years old when I was diagnosed with bone cancer. I had a high-grade sarcoma in my right knee. I dealt with infections and complications initially for about 4 years. And then when I was 19 years old, after my freshman year of college, I elected to amputate my leg, basically to regain an active lifestyle. So that 4-year period where I had a knee replacement and I was trying to kind of salvage my limb, I was inactive. I wasn't able to compete in sports. I was not able to even really go out with my friends even and go to the park or anything like that. So it really actually improved my quality of life quite a bit because I was able to really regain that active lifestyle again, really participate in all the different activities that I was hoping to achieve. And having been a football player, a track athlete, and I played other sports as well, that was a really big part of my life. So I wanted to get back to that. So when I decided to amputate my leg, I always knew that I wanted to compete in track and field and that I wanted to try to compete in the Paralympic Games. So in this photo on the right-hand side, I was able to make it to the 2012 Paralympic Trials just 2 years after my amputation. I finished, I think, dead last in the competition, but it was great to at least make it there. And then you fast forward about 2 years, and this is at the national championships in 2014, actually, and close to my hometown here in San Mateo in California. And I took third in the 200-meter dash. So that is coming down the home stretch. Probably about 20 meters to go in the race. So falling apart a little bit, like Dr. Gailey said. But really that development and trying to achieve those goals was a very long process for me. And kind of getting, to that point was, there was a lot of elements that kind of went into developing my training. So we'll get into that in just a moment. But before I do, I wanted to kind of highlight, sort of how the classification system works in the Paralympics. So the Paralympics are elite competition, very much like the same level as the Olympics. Of course, they occur shortly thereafter, and it's broken down with a couple of different impairment categories. And you'll see the T category stands for track. We'll get into the field events in just a second. But these numbers kind of classify the different types of impairments and the severity. So when you look at the T11 through T13 category, that's visual impairments. 11 is going to be somebody who is completely blind, they have no vision, and 13 is somebody who is partially blind. So they do have the ability to see to some degree, but still have pretty severe visual limitations. T20 is a newer category, so that's intellectual impairments. And then T35 through T38 is coordination impairments. So there's a lot of sort of like wheelchair athletes and things of that nature, folks who generally cannot walk, so they're competing in a wheelchair. T40 to 41, so short stature, and then 40 will just be shorter, 41 a little bit taller, and then T42 to 44. This is what I competed in, and I believe actually after I stopped competing, they separated it out to now have the T61 to 64 categories. So they split out people with different disability types, of course. So this range is really the above knee and below knee amputee. So T42 is what I was classified as originally. That is a above the knee amputee, and then 43 and 44 were below the knee, bilateral and unilateral. And then 45 through 47 would be the upper limb deficiencies. So it was missing an arm or impaired muscle power in the shoulders, things of that nature. And then, of course, there's the wheelchair racing side of it as well, as I mentioned. And then on the field side, so same concept, right? The same classifications, but what really is interesting here is that with the wheelchair athletes, what you're going to see is seated throw events. So all of the categories I mentioned that are able to run, that have that are they're doing upright throws, but then the seated throws are actually really fascinating, where they have devices where the athletes can sit in a chair and throw a shot put or throw a discus. It's really great to see. So I definitely encourage you guys to look up some of the videos of that, and I'll share a few here as well. But one thing to note, and with those classifications, is that the events differ, right? So over a 2-week period, you obviously can't have every single athlete compete in every single event, right? So with the Olympics, they separate it by gender, right? So men and women, and then they have the different events. Given the number of disabilities in different classification categories, they really highlight the most competitive events for the different specialties or the different classifications. So, they can't fit in all of those events in that time frame. So basically what you'll see is, the 100-meter dash, obviously one of the most exciting events, that's going to have the broadest range of athletes. Pretty much every category will compete in that, whether they're a wheelchair athlete, visually impaired, or an amputee. You'll see in the 200, it's again more visual impairments, coordination. So that is again wheelchair athletes, and then amputees, and then same with the 400. So for an above knee amputee, you actually do not see as many 400-meter runners. It's not a classified event in the Paralympic Games. We are limited to the 100, 200, and long jump. And then as you get into the longer distances, really 800 meters and up, you're not going to see nearly as many people with limb deficiencies in these categories because the burden and the strain. And I think that last question really speaks to that. Running an 800-meter sprint as an above the knee amputee is extremely taxing and really is not a particularly competitive event. So you'll see a lot more, wheelchair races in the, 800 plus category. And then, of course, high jump, long jump, those are pretty broad on the standing athlete side. So I quickly want to share a few videos because I think this is pretty exciting to see. So I pulled up a couple of different videos here. This is the wheelchair, some men's race in the 100-meter category. And it's really fascinating to see. You can see kind of the power that they're able to generate. Of course, you can imagine over a 1,500-meter or 5,000-meter race, they're picking up a lot of speed even in this short time. So they're maintaining that momentum. So when they're doing 10 plus laps around the track, you get some very competitive races where that top speed is really maximized, and you get to see a lot more sort of activity from those athletes. The visually impaired long jump as well. So this is a fascinating event, probably my favorite event in all of track and field. This is Lex Gillette. He is a world record holder in the long jump. He is completely blind. And you'll see in this event, I'll try to pause it right when he takes off, but he essentially has a guide who is standing at the front of the long jump pit and providing sound cues. So usually it's a clap or some sort of yell on a cadence so that he can follow that sound. And you see him move out of the way there at the end. He follows that sound, and at the last second, you see the guide here in the orange, he's moving out of the way. So now this athlete has a straight trajectory. They're following that sound. They have absolutely no idea what they're jumping into. And he's jumping 6.5, 7 meters in this case. And a lot of times you'll see some pretty challenging moments for some of these athletes where they have a little bit of a miscue, and in this case there was other noise, right? He was in a stadium. This was, I believe, at the IPC World Championships, so there's a stadium of people cheering, so it kind of distracts him, and you can see he kind of goes off the side of the long jump pit there. So really these guys are fearless. It's really cool to watch, and the level of competition that they're achieving is really fascinating. So last but not least, I'll share a couple more examples here of the amputee categories. So this is the women's T42 race. And what you'll see here again is those different classifications. You have some unilateral amputees, some bilateral amputees. And what I would kind of look at here is you look at kind of the biomechanics and how people are compensating throughout this race. So you'll see a lot of hip hinging. You'll see kind of the bilateral amputees doing sort of a circular motion with their legs. So they're actually not running with knees in some cases. And it's really kind of fascinating to see kind of the different variable approaches, right? Even in the block starts, they're coming out very differently than a able-bodied athlete. And even within the races, you can see here, the bilateral amputee in lane 7, second from the bottom here, she has that circular motion. And the bilateral amputee to the left of her in lane 6 is actually running with knee, so she has a more straightforward motion. And you can see even the fastest athlete in this category, she has that hip hinge that I was talking about, and that is very common in track and field, right? The goal for any track and field athlete, it's a very mechanical sport. You're very much trying to sort of achieve, mechanical excellence as well as symmetry when you're competing. So for an athlete with a unilateral amputation, that symmetry is very hard to achieve, but the end goal is to really start to kind of develop that same cadence as an able-bodied athlete would have when they're competing. This is an example of a long jump. So this, I believe, is a Danish athlete who, really interesting here as well. It's very common for amputees now to jump off their prosthetic side. So for a long time, I think not until around 2012,
Excuse me,
I don't know if you're showing your slides right now, but we're still on the video.
Sorry, what's that?
Are you sharing your slides right now?
Oh no, the video still.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So an athlete like this will, traditionally you would see a lot of the unilateral amputees jumping off their sound side. And, actually, interestingly enough, it started to really evolve. And, personally, I made the transition accidentally when I was jumping at a competition, and I accidentally went off of my prosthetic side because I took the wrong number of steps in my approach. So I jumped off my prosthetic side and actually ended up setting a PR, and that kind of changed my approach to long jump entirely. So I started to make that transition, and it became a common thing where the majority of unilateral amputees now jump off that prosthetic. I think what I was covering in the rest of the presentation was really kind of how my training has evolved over time, and kind of two main considerations is the biomechanics and symmetry are really kind of the two most important elements as an amputee to try to achieve. So I'm not sure if we got to watch the video of Justin Gatlin, but I know during Dr. Gailey's presentation, he kind of spoke about getting out of the blocks and that approach for an athlete. So the goal is, as an athlete, to really look as much like an able-bodied athlete as possible. And of course, there's challenges to overcome throughout that. And then beyond that, I've worked with a number of different coaches, whether collegiate level coaches or the coaches from the Olympic Training Center, to really develop a long-term program. So we refer to it as periodization, where your training in the off season is going to be very different than your training in the preseason and in competition season as well. So there's a lot of emphasis on sort of load management and making sure that you take care of your body so that you're capable of achieving peak performance during the season. And a big part of that is, in the off season, you're more focused on perhaps endurance running and cross training and still, doing some strength training. And then as you transition towards the season, you do more sprint endurance in the preseason. You're still doing the strength training, but you start to do more of that sprint endurance to build your foundation. And then once you get into the season, that is where you really start to pick up with more active, high intensity, lower distance, to really focus on, building that power and strength. And again, with all of that, there's always an element of, maintaining that mechanical balance and that symmetry in your training. So I guess I would just, leave it at that. It is a very kind of comprehensive training program that goes into this, and it evolves over time and throughout the different phases of the track season. And then within each of those training sessions, there's also a lot of elements. I spend 45 minutes to an hour of my training just warming up, so activating the proper muscles. Again, focusing on really developing hand-eye coordination and muscle memory, and then translating that into the sprints. Where in any given training session, I probably spend maybe 10 or 15 minutes actually running, and then another 15 or 20 minutes cooling down, working on my core, and again, really making sure that I'm healthy and that my body is, managing that load effectively.
Thank you, Ranjit. This was informative. I wish we had more time, but I'm very happy to have you. This was great. Honestly, honored to have you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This will be posted as a recording on YouTube under the Clinician Engineer Hub. So in case you guys had any difficulties hearing us or weren't able to catch the whole thing, feel free to check it out.